Kalispera σας. Good evening, everyone. Let me start by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We are committed to our reconciliation journey because at its heart, reconciliation is about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples for the benefit of all Victorians. Welcome to tonight's online seminar by the Greek community of Melbourne, which will be delivered by Herbert Ploegman on Athens as a multiple, a city enacted through art and a city solidified by infrastructural change. This seminar was originally advertised with a different title, Art and Gentrification in Athens, but I'm sure the speaker won't stray too far away from the theme. Just a few housekeeping items. Firstly, allow me to thank the sponsor of tonight's seminar, Jeffrey Conahan, and I invite you all to become sponsors of the seminar of your choice. It's only a tax-deductible $100 donation. Furthermore, let me remind you that the next 4 seminars will be all online with international guest speakers. We do also have a week's break due to Greek Easter, but we'll also forfeit the use of the mezzanine level as the Greek Centre is one of the venues of the very popular comedy festival. Look at the program. There are quite a few appealing acts. And a special mention regarding next week's seminar by the legendary Professor Paul Cartledge on ancient Sparta, myths and reality. And just a reminder for those that will have any questions during our Q&A interval, simply submit them through the chat or comment section on Facebook or YouTube. Let's return to tonight's seminar, where we've invited a special guest, Olympia Nelson, to introduce tonight's speaker, as she's much closer to the subject matter than I am. Olympia is a PhD candidate in the Department of Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies at the University of Sydney, where she's under the stewardship of Professor Brasidas Karalis, and her PhD is on Byzantine art. Olympia, best of luck with your studies and research. I pass on the baton to you to introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you so much, Nick, and good evening, everyone. My name is Olympia, and I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Herbert Ploegman tonight for his lecture, Athens as a Multiple, a city enacted through art and a city solidified by infrastructural change, as part of the 2022 Greek History and Culture Seminars program. This excellent and enriching lecture series for me has provided a lens to view all the different facets of Greece, historically, culturally, through gender, class, and tonight I'm really looking forward to learning about Greece through an imaginative framework involving art and anthropology. Herbert Ploegman, who joins us now from Amsterdam, works as a PhD candidate and lecturer at the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology of Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Before commencing the PhD, he was an editor for the academic art journal Kunstlich, a curatorial fellow of the plug-in program at Schloss Ringenberg, and a program editor for Perdu, Centre for Experimental Poetry in Amsterdam. Herbert's connection to Greece goes back to 2013, when he travelled there for the first time to visit some newly made friends. He was immediately inspired by the various dichotomies in the city. Firstly, how solidarity practices took shape in a city beleaguered by a sovereign debt crisis. Later on, he took up interest in the unfolding and thriving contemporary art scene. He questioned what a crisis meant for a city and for a people. What does crisis do, and how do people respond? How is art flourishing within this context, and what implications it has for the city? Herbert set out to investigate aspects of these developments from an anthropological angle, resulting in an analysis in progress of multiple Athenses coming about at once. This fascination led him back a further time in 2015, where he stayed for around 6 to 7 months, again for a few months in 2017, and then his official fieldwork began just prior to the pandemic in February 2020. Herbert's current project involves examining an art walk across the centre of Athens as organised by an artist, and the Μεγάλο Περίπατος, so the Great Promenade, as planned and implemented by the current Mayor of Athens, Kostas Bakoyannis. By juxtaposing these two walks, he's questioning, how does Athens exist? How does it allow for difference and change? And how does it maintain its consistency? Herbert took the idea that Athens can also be understood as a practiced object, an object multiple, in fact. That is to say, Athens is neither to be viewed as exclusively singular nor exclusively a plural object. And one of the reasons that I'm enjoying this paradox is that I've always wondered about that kind of equivocal S that we put at the end of Athens in English and French, Athènes, but not German, Athen. What might this ghost of a plural betoken? Of course, we know that cities are multiplistic, so different suburbs and enclaves, but also different manifestations over time. For me, Herbert presents the other experiential side of a topic that seems to sit deep in language itself. He comes at it afresh through art and artists' intentions, which promise to resolve weird things in the philological past. So, Athens was historically in the plural, like Athenai. This was common with many cities taking names in a similar form, like Thebai, Thebes, Patrai, Patras, Serai, Vasai, Mykenai, and Delphi has to be plural, as in Idelphi. In modern Greek, Athens, Thebes, and Patras have all been reduced to singular, so Athena, Patra, Thiva, but others take the modern first declension plural in es, such as Vases or Seres. So we're more likely dealing with a general tendency of the Greek language to replace feminine plural city names by singular ones, logically enough, since although a city is many things, you expect it to only have a singular name. But Greeks naturally join plural and singular in the very description of languages, like we say ta Ellinika, the Greek words or the Greek ways of saying things, or ta Anglika, the Englishes or the English words or English habits of speech. Language mutates just as much as cities. For example, we now apply plural pronouns to a singular person, they, them. But I don't think Herbert is here to talk about words, but things, spaces, artistic dynamics, environments, realities, although he will do it with language, to revisit a place that we know and love for all the things that it is. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our guest of honour tonight, Herbert Ploegman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olympia. Hello and good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Nick Dallas for inviting me to give this presentation, and Olympia for the kind and generous introduction. Looking at the program of this lecture series, it's really an honor to find myself between the names scheduled and all the topics dealt with. And I sincerely hope that I will likewise provide you with some interesting perspectives on Athens and Greece tonight. I hope you will not be bothered too much by the fact that I am not with you in Melbourne right now, and that the connection will allow for a smooth lecture through digital means. My goal for tonight is to focus on narration and presentation rather than delving too deep into the theoretical arguments on which I base my own argument. For this would require more than the time available to me. Yet given the not so commonsensical approach I am taking, I will need to invoke some concepts that I hope will turn out to be helpful rather than obstructing. A suitable starting point, I believe, is the naming of the city. In Dutch, my mother tongue, Athens is called Athene. In German, like Olympia also mentioned, the language I've learned in high school besides English, Athens is called Athene. And the language I've been learning most recently, modern Greek, calls Athens Athena. But like Olympia already alluded to, here's the rub. Athens has both singular and plural names. Because in ancient Greek, Athens was called Hyathenae, and in Katherevousa from the 19th century on until the 1970s, Athenae was used. Now, my argument will in fact not be etymological of nature, as that is not my expertise. But I hope to integrate some of this observation into my anthropological analysis. For now, what I want to keep from this is that Athens as a toponym exists in plural and singular simultaneously. Olympia already briefly pointed to some historical causes and language practices. Even if they may be valid, for the sake of my own analysis, I try to stay away from conclusions for the time being. However, similar to the name of Athens existing in singular and plural at the same time, my argument is that Athens as a city is a constantly emerging object that similarly exists between multiple and singular. To quote Annemarie Moll, a scholar of the body and the medical who inspires my thinking, more than one, less than many. For those interested, this kind of thinking derives from mathematics and biology, in which fractals are a well-known phenomenon, repetitive patterns with endless detail. Why is it significant and relevant to think about Athens in this kind of complicated way? I believe that there are multiple reasons for that. First of all, somehow Athens combines a host of roles, so to say. A list might entail the following: the capital of the 2004 Olympic Games, the guardian of ancient heritage, the capital of an indebted European country, and the locus of an economic crisis, a site of riots and protests against European loan packages and austerity measures, a hub for refugees, the new place to be for artists, tourists, and real estate investors, the outer boundary of Fortress Europe, and I could probably go on. How could Athens be all of that parallelly or serially, the one thing following the other? Secondly, it matters to think about Athens like this because Athens has been involved in fluxes of rapid change, notably over the past years. Last summer, I crossed the Pedion to Arios Park with a friend and fellow scholar who lives in Athens. Freddo espresso in hand, he asked me if I didn't think Athens had changed a lot and whether I still liked it. To him, Athens had lost much of the appeal, comfort, and atmosphere it had before. Having lived in cities across the UK, the Netherlands, and Germany, he much preferred to be back in Athens, so far at least. I remember walking through the streets of Athens late 2014 for the first time, and then during a longer stay in 2015. Many shop windows were empty, and next to the entrances to polykatikias, apartment blocks, the omnipresent yellow banners with Polite and Enikiazete could be found. For about 10,000 or 20,000 euros, apartments were sold by owners who might not be able to afford them anymore. How different were the recent years? Even during the pandemic, real estate prices were soaring. Investors were buying entire blocks at once, sometimes to earn a golden visa together with it, a passport and entrance to the European Union. At least between 2017 and 2020, Airbnb was appearing at every street corner, so to say, and was recognizable from street level by the little key lockers next to entrances in which the keys of houses were kept ready at hand for arriving tourists. What fascinates me in this is, how is it that Athens, firstly as a signifier, but also as a locus, a place, a topos, manages to keep itself somehow stable, coherent, and distinctly Athens, while changing so fundamentally and so rapidly? What are the conditions that facilitate both the stability and the change? As my friend pointed out, things are changing in Athens. Yet, Athens, as the capital of Greece, remains Athens. One of my questions is, how is that fact kept stable? What is the work involved in keeping Athens Athens? If this is a work, and with other scholars I argue that it is a constant and repeated effort, then it means that as a bottom line, Athens as an object, as a fact, is not stable. This may well resemble some of your own experiences of returning to Athens and seeing the same place, but somehow realizing that it is different than it was before. It also means that what Athens is can be challenged by performing different practices. By focusing on specific cases in my work and briefly in this presentation, I hope to show how Athens is precisely in and through specific situations and in tension. By tracing differences between these cases, I hope to take you along in my analysis of how stability is a thing artificially created and sustained, and how instability features as a constant. In what follows, I will introduce one case study, an artistic event I took part in the summer of 2020, an artistic walk from the neighborhood of Petralona on the west side of the inner city, across Philopappou Hill, alongside Acropolis, towards Plaka. Later, I will move on to discuss an urban redevelopment plan, a different kind of walk, if you wish, to Μεγάλο Περίπατο, the Great Walk or the Great Promenade. For my research paper, I reviewed footage I made of this art event one summer night in July 2020, for which I had booked 2 spots. I am showing a few stills here as an illustration. In advance email communication, we as participants were instructed to wear shoes that would be solid and comfortable for a hike, and light clothes suitable for the warm summer evening. Additionally, we were requested to bring a device that could play an audio file sent to us digitally for during the walk. The second spot I had reserved for a friend that I would meet at the location that we were instructed to go to, this quiet dead-end street in Petralona. In a clip that shows the start of the event, the artist, dressed in a sporty outfit, invites the 20 people present to gather around him for a while in the middle of the quiet street, giving them a number of instructions by speaking in English. If you start to find it difficult, or just go on your own pace, and we'll meet there. Feel free to move around, keep close to me or far apart. He counts down for each of us to start the sound file simultaneously at our individual devices. Then in the subsequent clip, I see how the artist has moved onto the pavement, stands still, immerses himself in a moment of silence, his headphones on his head and his back turned to the downstairs entrance of his apartment. The audio track that I replay at a later time, I discover, contains a voice instructing us that moment to concentrate for a short while on what is going on in our bodies. Before we begin, please find yourself in a comfortable standing position. Pay attention to the full length of your body. What is the distance between the ground and the floor of your pelvis? Try to picture an imaginary point elevated higher up, exactly 69 meters above the spot you're standing on. Subsequently, in the video clip, I notice him turning his body to the right a little later and beginning to walk towards the exit of the little street. What I hadn't noticed before, however, is how a man on the pavement steps back to avoid bumping into the artist at the moment he starts moving. A cameraman filming the artist follows suit, and after both have passed, I see the man, plastic bag in hand, bending over to the car from which he stepped away just moments ago. My camera pans towards the main street, registering how the participants follow the direction the artist takes. The man, in turn, disappears from the image. Crucially, the near collision between the two men on the pavement sheds light on the entanglement of two rather diverging practices. In spite of the irregularity of it, and it's only briefly disrupting the flow of things, the interference indexes that each of the businesses the two men were engaged in is not self-evident. They could have been different, and additionally, as events, they do collide in some sense, or rather they are entangled in their mutual coming about, partly similar, partly different. Give me 1 second, please. So here, in this fleeting moment, we basically encounter a situation that says it all. We, that is the artist, together with us, our devices, the files sent on beforehand, his cameraman with gear, and the pavement and the warm evening and his neighbor, are performing or enacting Athens in and with and through art. Meanwhile, the neighbor, with his car and his plastic bag, his house and his plants, as well as this unexpected group of people around him that day, is enacting Athens in and with and through his daily routines. This is something different than perceiving Athens from different points of view. It is about interfering with its materiality in multiple ways. This observation, to me, is rather radical, because it makes many things symmetrical. The art performance and the daily life of the neighbor, but also the humans and the things involved in these practices. My case study allows me to analyze the details and repercussions of these processes in particular contexts. Simultaneously, the arguments I'm using are not new. They've been made repeatedly in the scholarly tradition of actor network theory, of which Bruno Latour is an important figure. The way I am approaching this is through what some call late A&T, as developed by Annemarie Mol, who works here in Amsterdam, where I am, and John Law, a scholar who has worked in the UK and in Norway mostly. Based on this observation, one can also conclude that in some way, there's no prior or anterior situation surrounding the art event. Both the art performance and the daily errands with the related materials present in the situation are realizing Athens in the present. In other words, the objects and the subjects emerge together. All that was there before, the apartment blocks, the streets, the art institution involved, etc., can be analyzed as earlier sets of practices that have been sustained, solidified, and sedimented, if you wish. Practices having been turned into givens. An example of this, I discuss in my forthcoming research paper, is the street names of Petralona, the artist has been collecting information about, and which he discusses in his artistic walk. He announces it as an anecdotal story about the ordering of the street names in the city grid. Ancient Greek tribes lined up alongside each other and squared with a common enemy, the Trojans. A parallel he draws is one of recent events of racism and xenophobic rhetoric in Greece towards immigrants coming from Syria, Afghanistan, or other countries. The violent murder of an immigrant some years back in the streets around us serves as a case in point. I will come back to that. As for the urban planners who allocated the street names, the artist argues, they knew well how to make use of their capacities to spatially lay out a certain narrative that would last. One that might attract attention and resonate, or so the artist suggests, with affinities that are sustained within what we know as the Greek nation and its associations with ancient Greece. Street names tend to hold, as they are reiterated in and distributed across space, street maps, people's memories, and official planning documents, altogether giving relative permanence to these names in the places they have come to belong to. To summarize, the reference to the street names and the street naming department points to the practice of manipulation, interference, but here with respect to the techniques of making things hold, of stabilizing things. It shows us how certain practices have become sedimented and been made common sense. And not only this, but it also shows us that power, institutions, and legislation as mediating actors all have their stakes in the sustenance of the materialities as well as imaginations of Athens. As for art, I want to highlight the contrast here. While the practices of street naming cause a continuity and stability through a sustenance recognizable as a specific urban landscape, the art intervention does something different. It intervenes, but only once. While we listen to the audio track about the violent killing of the market vendor, the artist makes a choreographical move in an open space between two parked cars that bring us to a brief halt while he lies down on the asphalt, like the body of the dying person. Some people present in the neighborhood join us in watching him, intrigued, like us, by the unfamiliar move, even though they lack the particular narration that we are having on our headphones. The murder on the market vendor around that location is actualized for a moment through an interplay between the story on our headphones, the sight, the performative gesture of our host, and our brief dwelling on that spot, our witnessing and associating. It's being presenced, brought to presence, while mostly the event lies dormant, is muted and erased, or is absenced, in and among other practices and materialities constituting Athens. In the paper, I illustrate this by referring to my own impression of that place and my memories of it. With the setting sun casting the streets in a deep orange and making the climate rather pleasant to walk in, drosia, one might call it, I would not have associated that particular setting and the sensations it gives me to a radical murder right there, racial murder right there, sorry. I was not in the know of that occurrence. Likewise, participants of the art walk would not have gained insight in the constellation of related street names called after ancient Greek tribes on the particular path we followed. The artist is presencing certain social material realities by means of his intervention and by means of the materials we are surrounded by. Interestingly, this knowing operates through two different awarenesses. On the one hand, the story of the artist based on an accumulation of observations and collected learnings as a summative or archival account, perhaps. On the other, the durational synesthetic experience of crossing the neighborhood on foot, like we do that particular evening. It seems to me that this contrast between the 2 points that the practiced nature of knowledge, it seems to me that this contrast between the 2 points points to the practiced nature of knowledge, and by that of realities. Stating this would, I believe, confront me with debates around phenomenology, where perception perhaps is taken to be more central than practice. Phenomenology is partly similar and partly at odds with the material semiotic practice-oriented approach I am taking. Both think in terms of an emergent world, or worlds, of worlding. Both have a strong interest in the dimensionality through which this happens. If the philosopher Heidegger imagines the world to emerge between the fourfold of earth, sky, mortals, and gods, and humans dwelling in the forthcoming of it, material semiotics, or at least by words of John Law, thinks through topologies of relations, and of a hinterland of ramifying sets of relations. In any case, what we can take from this without bothering too much about the complexity of the theories is that both regard spatiality elementary to the world emerging. Yet they differ in how they see spatiality involved in the world or worlds that are coming about. The spatiality for both is not the kind of spatiality as understood through external Cartesian x, y, or z coordinates, to quote Robert Oppenheim. The spatiality is not bound to the map as we know it, yet ties together space and time in different or multiple ways. For Heidegger, this is more human-oriented than for Law and Moll, where a stricter symmetry between human and non-human is of relevance. So when I said before that the artist is presencing certain socio-material realities by means of his intervention and by means of the materials we are surrounded by, we need to see this in relation to spatialities of emerging worlds. For me, hinterland works quite well as a metaphor and a reference to materiality, to think about the spatiality in which certain things are presenced by the artist. Hinterland is not only the surrounding area as a geographic reality, but rather the set of sedimented practices that have made a world work in some ways and not in others, and that take active part in the shaping of newly emerging worlds. The artist makes connections with things more or less remote in order to actualize the murder to some extent. Through earlier experiences, through electronic devices, through the sign-up process for the art walk, through the notion of art being around, etc. From here, one might ask the question, what are the materialities that the murder is based in? What can presence it? And how is it that this murder tends to be rather absent? To recall, I proposed in my case study above that that both the artwork and the daily life of the neighbor are emerging synchronously. But what with all that which seemed to be there before, the houses, the cars, and more abstract things like art? Following John Law's concept of the hinterland, these can all be understood as earlier practices solidified into an unquestionable state of history. By looking at the picture in the PowerPoint like this, we could see the hinterland still do things. It affords people to live in the houses, and it affords us as walkers to follow the directions of the streets and none other. Here I actually touch upon part of the experiment that the artist was doing, how it was impossible to walk the trajectory in a straight line due to the landscape. Having clarified how I have come to see the presence of things around as outcomes of practices with relative stability to them, perhaps now it is time to turn to my second case study, O Μεγάλος Περίπατος, the Great Promenade or Great Walk, a different kind of walk. And as a remark, this part of my presentation is still more tentative of nature. It was not far into the pandemic, while I was still in Athens for my fieldwork, despite that new condition, that many on social media started expressing their outrage about a newly implemented infrastructural plan, the redesign of the center, all the way from the Kalimarmaro Stadium behind Zapio and the National Gardens, up to the National Archaeological Museum at Patission Avenue. In fact, besides praise about the fact that something was happening, there were multiple reasons for which people expressed their anger. For one, it was the fact that Panepistimiou Avenue, an arterial road from the east to the west of the city, between the two most prestigious squares, Syntagma and Omonia, turned from 6 lanes into 3 lanes, and the traffic jams were reaching into the suburbs, according to some. Others mocked the poor urban furniture that was installed, while in fact exorbitantly large expenses were done for this program. Even it was called a pilot project, 2 or 3 million euros were spent on it. For instance, 570 planters of 500 to, this is what Panepistimiou Street looks like. Yes, and the planters are visible actually. 570 of these planters of 500 to 550 euros each were installed on Panepistimiou Avenue to form a barrier between the car traffic and pedestrians and cyclists. What fascinates me here is that, like the art walk, the intervention in the streets of Athens is a matter of practices in the question of relative stability of the object. The object of Panepistimiou Street Avenue, on which I focus in the first place, but also the object of the city of Athens, as somehow they cohere as objects. To begin with, in contrast to the art walk that I followed, the practices that keep Panepistimiou stable and in place are more established and sustained. These practices have collectively shaped the hinterland that is not so easily altered, and which helps keeping the street as it is in general. How then is it possible that despite this relative stability, an arterial road in downtown Athens changes from 6 lanes into 3 lanes nearly overnight? To me, it suggests that the hinterland should not only prevent from changes being made to it, but also shape and facilitate certain changes, and not others. It draws on different relationalities. Everything starts from the vision of the mayor that wants to reshape the future of the city, of the historical city of Athens, Vice Mayor Axiotis stresses when he starts talking to me in an interview last February about the project he is responsible for. Doing the actual project means that you have to do that in respect to the heritage that is also here in the city of Athens. He continues immediately. He explains to me that Μεγάλος Περίπατος is a campaign name, an umbrella name under which various projects in the city center of Athens happen. He continues by telling me that the studies, the plans, and the projects get authorized by 3 different ministries: the Ministry of Infrastructure and Traffic Control, the Ministry of Culture, and the Ministry of Environment. If the municipality wanted to do something wicked, he emphasizes, even if I didn't ask about it, the ministries will prevent that from happening. So here are a few first leads to understanding how Panepistimiou Avenue could change so rapidly. 3 ministries permitted it, and the mayor has a vision of reshaping the future of the city. How past, present, and future bleed into each other here, in practice, would deserve more space. But it is interesting to note that in 2020, Tanea newspaper registered the words of Mayor Bakoyannis: «Ξεχάστε την Πανεπιστημίου που ξέρατε. Πάμε για κάτι καινούριο. Πάμε να αλλάξουμε την πόλη». In my interview, I asked Vice Mayor Axiotis about this remark of forgetting about Panepistimiou we used to know. After all, on the renders of the new plan, I remarked, much of the elements present in the street for years were still visible. The trilogia of the university, the academy, and the library stood its ground in the new plan, perhaps without surprise. Axiotis explained to me that the plans for the new Panepistimiou Avenue were shaped by the idea to connect the past with the present and the future. A specific term that can characterize our actual impact on Panepistimiou Street, the new Panepistimiou Street, Axiotis tells me, is that we're trying to retain something that is called, I will say it in Greek, achronikotita. I can describe it as it's a state that glides through the past to the present and the future, and will be retained on a specific character throughout the years and the centuries. you will have to have marbles. You have to have specific trees like platania, that is centuries trees, you know? And you have to have the possibility of everything connecting together and giving this achronicotita character to that kind of street. Apart from that, you have to choose a specific color that also falls under achronicotita. And this color is gray-white color. It's not the red color of the pavement. The red color resembles the present. The gray-white color resembles the achronicotita, the no time aspect. What I find most striking in Axiotis' description of creating achronicotita is how he is rendering out certain aspects and replacing them. The red pavement needs to go. A gray-white color needs to replace it in order to reach this condition of timelessness and stability, I would add. His remark about achronicotita inevitably reminds me of the presencing and absencing I discussed earlier. The red color of what he relates to the present is to be absent from the street. The color of marble needs to replace this. Recently, a friend from Italy reminded me of how the color of marble itself has come to replace the abundance of colors that the marble was decorated with in the ancient past. So the picture that Vice Mayor is weaving together here is one that lacks a presence and that is in some sense exclusive. On the same street, a few years earlier, it must have been late 2015, I attended the demonstration with people from a solidarity group that had invited me. I cannot right now remember the exact purpose of the demonstration. After all, many of them were held around that time, and many of them took panepistimiou as a starting point. I do remember how behind us in the march, anarchist demonstrators took out poles of traffic signs, thereby changing the street, yet not changing it in such a radical and profound ways as the Μεγάλος Περίπατος seems to aim for. What remains now is a brief suggestion of how these variegated practices somehow make for a single Athens. In the beginning, I've argued for an Athens multiple that is more than one, but less than many. I've shown how, by starting from practices, the city is in a constant emergence. An emergence in which multiple Athenses emerge simultaneously, and partly in overlap and cohesion, partly in tension. As for the tension, I think this became clear mostly from the excluding aspect of the plans the vice mayor unfolded. And perhaps also the way the murder of the migrant tends not to be part of central knowledge. As for the overlap and cohesion, I've not said many things that could help sustain that argument. Yet, we shouldn't forget that the art walk took us from the archaeological sites of Philopapo Hill and the Acropolis. Even if they were slightly less important in the framework of that walk, they are being put central in the plan of Μεγάλος Περίπατος, and thus they do overlap. And this is only the beginning of that analysis. For me, having established this analysis of Athens, it allows for the tracing of so many more aspects of Athens emerging. One of the things I could delve into is the way in which practices are connected to affects and emotions, as could, for instance, be seen when the municipality decided to implement the Μεγάλος Περίπατος plan. Another thing is how the different objects we encountered, a street and an art project, compare in terms of spatialities in the city. I hope I gave you an insight in my thinking and that it was inspiring to you. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Herbert, for that sort of fascinating presentation. And it's a pity that the last 2 years, most of us have been in lockdown or semi-lockdown, and we really haven't had many of the audience haven't had the opportunity to visit Greece and at least experience or see that great promenade and have a more personal connection to this seminar. We do have a few questions from our audience, and we'll start with those. The first one is from, let me just get it there. It's from Vasilis Chamis. Okay. He asks, what drew you to the concept of this project? Was there something unique or personal about your experiences in Athens that made it more compelling than other cities?
That's a good question, which could involve a very long answer, of course, but I will try to keep it brief. The first time I went to Greece and went to Athens, I encountered such a different reality, let's say, than I was used to in the Netherlands, and I was quite shocked about the fact that so little of what mattered in the context of Greece actually arrived in the Netherlands through news and through other ways, and that made me decide that actually I wanted to learn more about it, basically because for me it's a 3-hour flight away, and it's both part of Europe, perhaps on different sides. And throughout the years that I've been coming to Athens, what has really intrigued me is how all these changes happen, and how you can account for all these differences, basically. For a long time, it's been perhaps even overwhelming for me that so many different things were happening at the same time. And as I described in my presentation, I think this theoretical framework helps me understand how things run in parallel, but are not isolated from each other at the same time. So how they somehow tie in with each other and contribute to something that we perceive of as Athens and experience as Athens, and following my framework, practice as Athens. So that is, for me, it was kind of a way to integrate all the complexities that I encountered for several years. I hope that answers the question.
I have a question from one of our regular viewers, Conspiropoulos. Beside the controversial the Great Promenade walkway in the city of Athens, have there been any other infrastructural changes occurring in the environs of Athens?
For sure, there have. Depending on what time frame you look at, probably, but around Sigru Avenue, for instance, the cultural institutions have both got their own building, their own place, let's say. So Stavros Niarchos is at the far end, and Onassis is halfway. So the National Library actually moved from Panepistimiou Street to Onassis. To Stavros Niarchos. So these are just a few examples. Of course, the former airport that is being transferred into a residential area with particular characteristics. I think Airbnb has played a major role also in the inner city. What I showed it in one of the pictures, but rather small, that when I was walking through the inner city of Athens, on every street corner I could see old doors and old furnitures being put out on the streets, indicating how much I'd say reconstruction work was going on in all the houses of people, and possibly making them more ready for renting out, for instance. So those are a few examples of what is going on.
Okay, thanks for that. We've got a question from Olympia. It's great to see how the various street names stage a kind of war in the grid. Do you think that this embedded motive of contention in the names is in a sense destined to play out in the dialectic of urban interests that you've identified with the Μεγάλο Περίπατο?
That's an interesting question. And I think it would require a careful answer. I can try to do that right now. In some sense, you could say yes, indeed, it plays out in the dialectic of the urban interests nowadays, partly through, let's say, the collective imagination of what Greece is today, as connected to ancient Greece. This strongly informs the associations people make, let's say, and the way they make their city, they make their life. And so in that sense, it's not just a mental aspect, let's say, something that is in the heads of people, but it actually is also part of the daily practices of people. It becomes part of the daily practices of people. That would be a start of an answer to this question, I guess.
Thank you. One line that sort of stood out in your presentation, Herbert, was you said that in Athens, one can't walk in a straight line, one can't follow a straight trajectory. How do you think that sort of overflows into people's behavior and mentality?
Well, that is an even more difficult question, perhaps. What shall I answer to that? Well, the artist interestingly juxtaposes the grid form of the built environment, and then when we move to the archaeological site, he notices how it is more smooth, more curvy, and that there is a difference in that. Well, I've been thinking about that, and for sure it organizes the practices and the ideas of people in a certain way. But for instance, the contrast between the two, and that it is not curvy in the streets of Athens, but only in the archaeological site. It is also a way of relating that particular characteristic to the archaeological site as also an object, let's say, as a material object, and it plays into the into the beliefs of how an archaeological object, a site, needs to be maintained, for instance, and what is important to it and what is not important to it. And if you turn that around, the same might go for the built environment.
Okay. Thanks for that. Kostas, are there any more questions from the audience that you've picked up? Or okay. Okay. I think we might bring proceedings to a close. Herbert, thanks for taking the time out for this presentation. Best of luck with your research. Best of luck with the rest of your sort of PhD. Thanks for participating in this series. And if you're ever in Melbourne in the near future, the distant future, please come by the Greek Centre. Yeah.
That will be great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everyone. And just a reminder, next week's seminar by Professor Paul Cartledge, Ancient Sparta, Myths versus Realities. Hope to see you then.